Recording. And thank you everyone for coming today for our Earth Day panel. This is the 51st anniversary of Earth Day, and tonight we are joined by Dr. Vincenzo Ellis, Dr. John Madsen, and Dr. Kyle McCarthy. And Dr. Ellis is a professor in the College of Ag and Natural Resources, or Canner. He teaches conservation biology, and some of his research focuses on avian hemosporidian parasites. Did I say that right?
Perfect.
Okay, cool. Dr. Madsen is the department chair of Earth Sciences in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment. He teaches structural geology, plate tectonics, the geology of offshore wind, and environmental and applied geology. Some of his research focuses on coastal and estuarine geophysics and geological and geotechnical aspects of offshore wind projects, which I just took that from your CV, so I hope that's correct. And then Dr. Kyle McCarthy is also a professor in the College of Ag in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology. He teaches some classes like wildlife ecology and conservation, wildlife management, mammalogy, and some of his research focuses on threatened and endangered species, bird migration, and snow leopard conservation. And before we start, Dr. McCarthy, one of your graduate students, Imogene, I think she went viral this week on Twitter for posting some facts about snow leopards, or
yes, I think it was about bobcats, unless
the
I'm
bobcat.
mistaken. Yes, she was responding to the viral TikTok of the bobcat jumping on someone's shoulder and informing it with science, and that made it go viral too, which is always nice when you get some true science behind some of those things.
It's always good to get science to the masses.
Right.
So,
but not always easy. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. I was so excited to see that like an actual scientist was trending instead of fake science.
Right.
First up is Dr. Ellis. So if you want to share screen and talk about some of your interests or research, go ahead. And
sure. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for the invitation. I am going to talk a little bit about my research interests, but I'm going to get there in perhaps a slightly circuitous way. Let's see, share my screen. Okay, here we go. And then I can presentation mode. How about that? Can everybody see planet Earth?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Okay, so this is the famous Earthrise photo taken in 1968, just a couple of years before the first Earth Day in 1970. And so this is part of the Apollo 8 mission. And as the astronauts were coming around the moon, William Anders took out his camera and popped in some color film and snapped some iconic shots, including this one, which is the first time that as far as I know, that people saw the Earth as this little blue planet. So the first color photo of the Earth from a distance. So really, I mean, what a shot that is anyway. I mean, it's just fantastic. And it really, I think, the perspective is important has been important for the environmental movement, and is still very important today. And that sense of scale, of zooming out and seeing the big picture, is something that I want to focus on in just this brief talk here. And since this is a talk about Earth Day, I think it's worthwhile celebrating the Earth and the things that we love about the Earth. And so I want to talk about a special part of the Earth that I love, that's an important place for me. And that is the country of Brazil, and specifically the state of Minas Gerais, which is down here in sort of the southern eastern section of Brazil here. So here's Rio de Janeiro down in the bottom, Sao Paulo you can see here, and this is Minas. And I've lived and worked several years in Belo Horizonte, one of the smaller cities in Brazil of 4 million people, and it's in the state of Minas Gerais. My wife is from Brazil. She's from Minas. And so it means a lot to me. And Belo Horizonte, this city where I lived, is on a sort of transition in terms of the nature that's there. It's in what we call the Cerrado, but it's right on the transition to another part of Brazil that's called Mata Atlântica. So if you looked at a map of the biomes of Brazil, or if you just Googled it like I did here, you'll find a map that looks something like this. So this is Brazil, and Cerrado is the biggest neotropical savanna. So it's a dry, type of biome. And Mata Atlântica is Atlantic forest. And so here you can see the extent of Mata Atlântica. And I'm gonna show you a little bit better data at the end of the talk here. But so Belo Horizonte sits sort of right on this transition between Cerrado and Mata Atlântica. And so it was just such a fantastic place to live and to see these two really different environments and ecosystems. And so I just want to show you kind of what they look like. This is what the Cerrado looks like. It's this, someone once described it to me as almost like a desert without thorns. And it really is a bit like that. There's sort of sandy, it's hard to see in this picture perhaps, but there's sandy soils, very dry. You get sort of different heights of vegetation, but a lot of this kind of dry vegetation. It looks a lot like this. And then it's interspersed with riparian areas, which of course meant that weekends living in Belo Horizonte was just fantastic. You could drive, 40 minutes out of the city and, take a dip in a natural pool like this, get a natural massage under the waterfalls. I mean, really spectacular part of the earth, I have to say. And so, so this is Cerrado, and I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the wonderful flowers that you see everywhere. It's just such a lovely place. And the transition then happens to get us to Atlantic forest is, I guess in some places gradual, in some places faster, but the point is that it really does change quite a bit. You still get wonderful waterfalls, really kind of special views here, but a denser vegetation, much wetter, lots of trees, a sort of semi-closed canopy, really kind of another very different, very beautiful, and of course with Belo Horizonte sitting sort of right in the middle there. And to give you just a little bit more, I just want to show some more pictures of the Mata Atlântica, of the Atlantic forest. This is sort of taking a picture up into the canopy, and I guess I can still consider myself a bird person, so I needed a picture of at least one bird. So this is a tyrannid flycatcher. It's Attila rufus, but you can see that kind of closed canopy, lots of green in the Atlantic forest, lots of shade, and the Atlantic forest extends out to all the way to the coast, right? And so you can get these just absolutely magnificent views. This we took at near Sao Paulo, this picture. So a hike through this sort of really dark forest, with this high canopy, and then opening up into a wonderful beach, at the end, and you can see the forest, the trees going all the way down to the water. So I mean, just such a it's something that people value. You go there once, you see it once, it's enough to remember it for life. People really really value this natural land. And I was postdocing in Brazil, and as part of my postdoctoral research, or as part of my job as a postdoc there, I did a lot of teaching, and one of the courses that I got to teach was a field course where we spent a couple weeks in the Atlantic forest, brought a group of students out, and did some research projects, and it was really really lovely. And so here's a picture of from 2016 from this course. You can see I'm here on the left here, and you can see this the group of students and some of the other professors, and we're out here in more of this this Atlantic forest. But despite all this beauty, you know, this was 2016, and 2016 was the year after there had been a pretty horrible environmental disaster in that part of the world. So close to this area, a little bit south of Belo Horizonte, this photo was taken in a state park called the Rio Doce, the Doce River Park. And it's close to a city called Mariana, and Mariana, all in the same vicinity of where I was living, Belo Horizonte. And in Mariana, there was a huge mining operation to mine iron ore, operated by the mining company San Marco. And they were the tailings from the waste, you know, water and sediment and all this stuff from the mining would get collected into a big sort of reservoir that was held in place by a dam. And that dam was not structurally sound, and it burst in 2015. So here's the area where the dam burst. And it was absolutely devastating. It immediately killed 19 people, just flooded through the neighboring cities. This was millions and millions of liters of the tailings from the mine. And so of course, immediate death of people, hundreds of homes destroyed, a true environmental disaster as this stuff spilled across the landscape. And a lot of it got into a big river that's through here, this Doce River, where I was at the state park where the park is named after that river. And a lot of this, the mine tailings got into the Rio Doce, into that river, eventually made it out to the Atlantic. But I just want to show you kind of what 1 year after, what it looked like. So this is where we were teaching the course. So you can see that sort of before and after effect. So before, of course, on the top, and after on the bottom, when you can see this sort of sludge that's completely destroyed this river. And it was a striking thing for people in Brazil. I think for people around the world. You know, I was in Brazil, so this was on the news every day. And it was, of course, right next to where we were living. It was a huge deal. And these kind of environmental disasters, these sort of point occurrences like this, can really have a big impact in the media. They can really get people's attention. It reminds me a little bit of the 1 year before the first Earth Day, this big Santa Barbara oil spill, which also got people, you know, was on the news all the time. So these things really, they really make a big impact, and this one certainly did. But just like in that picture, that Earthrise picture, where we have a sort of zoomed back image of the Earth, right? It's useful and helpful to zoom out from this as well. So it looks like, wow, you know, I've been showing you all these pictures of the beauty of Atlantic forest, of Cerrado, of all these things. And here is this one event that sullied it. But that's not really the full story, and maybe not the big picture at all about what's going on with the natural parts of our Earth. And so I just want to show you some maps. These are maps of the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, and in different years. So this is the year 1500, Common Era, with the black, the filled in parts being Atlantic forest. Here's 1845. You can see we're starting to get some fragmentation and loss of the Atlantic forest. Here's 1907, quite a lot more. 1952, most of this is gone. 1973, and then to 2000, almost no Atlantic forest left, right? all of this stuff, if you drive through this northern part of Sao Paulo state, it's all coffee plantations, right? And other things, but a lot of coffee. And so these pictures of showing you the sort of the beauty of the Atlantic forest are a little bit, I'm showing you something that's not really there anymore. There's so little left of Atlantic forest. So here's, I showed you that sort of cartoon of the biomes of Brazil, and you saw this sort of big extent of Atlantic forest. And in this map here, we're seeing a better look, actually. So the yellow is the original extent of the Atlantic forest, and the dark green are the patches that are remaining. So there's very, very, very little left of the Atlantic forest actually throughout Brazil. It's really, I would say, an endangered biome, if you will. And this is the kind of thing that you see when you take a sort of a step back. And I think that's part of what the Earthrise, part of the appeal of the Earthrise photo, and part of its lessons for us in our modern age, and how we look at the planet and our impact on the planet. Okay, and so I said it was going to be a sort of circuitous route to get to my research, and it was. And so I'm actually not going to talk about avian hemisporidians, but just briefly to sort of wrap this up, tell you about another, besides losing Atlantic forest and forest in general, and other kinds of natural areas to habitat fragmentation, degradation, and simply loss. I want to talk about one other aspect, and I'm a disease ecologist, and one thing that has been noticed is that in many cases there seems to be some relationships between this degree of habitat fragmentation and especially zoonotic infectious diseases, so infectious diseases that are in both non-human animals and also in humans. And the major one, the main, what we would call vector transmitted infectious disease in the United States, is Lyme disease. And maybe you probably have heard of Lyme disease, maybe some of you have had Lyme disease. It's transmitted by, here in the Northeast, it's transmitted by black-legged ticks, Ixodes scapularis ticks. And this map here is showing incidences of Lyme disease. And Delaware is a high incidence state. It's one of the highest incidences of Lyme disease, per capita of the US. And what people have noticed is, this is work done in New York, is that, so here, these graphs are showing on the x-axis the size of forest fragments, and on the y-axis density of nymphs. These are the life stage of the tick that's most likely to transmit. It's a bacterium that causes Lyme disease, so most likely to transmit the Lyme bacterium. So here is density of nymphs. Here is the percentage of nymphs that are infected with the Lyme disease bacterium. And here is the density of nymphs that are infected. And so these things are related to our risk as humans of contracting Lyme disease. And what we can see here is, in the smallest of forest fragments, the sort of 1 hectare tiny fragments, you simply have higher risk of Lyme disease, of contracting Lyme disease. And there's a whole theory behind this called the dilution effect, which I don't need to I'm not going to explain now, but just to say that that this seems to be related really to the, well, actually I can explain briefly. It's related to, it seems to be related to the idea that small forest fragments hold less biodiversity. And when there's less biodiversity, especially of mesocarnivores, it allows mice populations to increase, and mice are the ones that are really good at sort of incubating the Lyme bacterium and allowing ticks to transmit it more easily. And so this is a big effort in my lab that we're looking into. We do a lot of molecular biology, and so we're really into the genotypes of Lyme bacterium that are transmitted, and whether these infections are actually the types of genotypes that get into humans. And so that's some of the stuff we're doing. And And that's it. It's a short little talk. I just wanted to talk about sort of my perspective on yeah, the Earth and you know, some of the things it means to me and how it's starting to fit into my research. So yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis. I have a quick question from that map. What's up with Massachusetts? Do people just not go outside in Massachusetts, or are they not reporting Lyme
I
disease?
had the same question. I know it's there, so it had to be some artifact. What is that?
Yeah, I have no idea actually. I have no idea. That's it looks like yeah, it's some kind of artifact. I don't know what it is though. But yeah,
Okay.
good eye, good eye. Yeah.
Any other questions? That's okay. If you think of one, you can always ask later. Next up is Dr. Madsen. Thank you again, Dr. Ellis, for sharing.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Let me go ahead and share screen. We're gonna go here. And let's go to slideshow. Oops, sorry. There we go. Is everybody seeing this slide that says fisheries research and offshore wind farms? And
Yep,
okay,
looks
yeah.
good.
What I want to do is just talk a little bit about some of the work I do actually with in the coastal and estuarine geophysics that I do, how we apply it to fisheries research. And so I'll talk about that a little bit, and then talk a little bit about the work that I do with offshore wind farms and how someone who actually thinks about rocks and sediments actually gets involved in wind turbines. But anyway, we'll hopefully cover that in this period of time here. So the fisheries research that I do, we actually look at sturgeon, and so it's a collaborative project, as most research efforts are. And so I work a lot with Matt Brees, Ned Hale from UD, Dwayne Fox from Delaware State, Amanda Higgs from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, and Dave Kazak, who's at the U.S. Geological Survey. So our work's funded by some foundations as well as some national federal government organizations. So you can see here we are at one of the areas that we work in the Hudson River. In the small tank area here are some Atlantic sturgeon that we actually have recovered and are getting ready to tag for that particular work that we're doing. So why study sturgeon? Turns out that they're listed as the most threatened group of animals by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Their time dates back to the earliest dinosaurs. They're adronomous to amphidronomous. In other words, they will live most of their lives in salt water, but then come to spawn in fresh water. That's the adronomous. And the others, the smaller fish, the short nose, they actually stay entirely in the fresh water where they live their life cycle. Probably the most famous thing about a sturgeon is their set of scutes, those 5 rows of bony plates that they have top and on both sides and underneath. And they can grow large, up to about 7.2 meters or 24 feet in length, and they can weigh up to 1,500 kilograms or a little over well, more than a ton. So they can grow to be quite large fish. They were completely overfished in the early 1900s. So they were mainly for 2 things. One, for their roe, for their eggs, which makes caviar. Even today, you can go into a Whole Foods and you can look at and buy sturgeon. That's not Atlantic sturgeon because it's an endangered species, but there is sturgeon that would sell for about $900 to $1,200 a pound. So it's quite expensive. Also, they're known, the meat of the sturgeon is sometimes called the Albany steak for the Hudson River where they came from, and that's supposed to be a very fleshy, fatty meat that's supposed to have a good taste with it. So during the early 1900s, completely overfished, near extinction, increasingly more polluted waterways, destroyed their pathways to their spawning areas. And so it's just been through the Clean Water Act coming in the early 1970s that they've begun to recover. And so we're trying to look at the population of Atlantic sturgeon as they recover along the east coast. So what do? I sit on a small boat with my back turned to the front of the boat, staring into a small laptop while we collect what's called side scan sonar data. And so you can see to the right there, we tow an instrument of towfish behind our boat, and we send out sound signals that travel down to either side. So it's side looking down to either side of the towfish. When you encounter a change in acoustic signal, so like maybe you take some energy and reflect it off of the fish, or you reflect off something that is a relief or makes a little bit of difference on the seafloor, you get a scattering of the energy, and that some of that returns back to the towfish, and we record amplitudes as a function of time. So basically in real life, what it actually looks like is, so here's the nadir zone where you'd be looking directly down at the bottom. So that's this part of the signal that would be here. And then to either side, you can see light colored returns. And anytime that you see a lighter yellow there means that some energy has been reflected at that point. And in particular, if you look here, you can see this nice straight white line. And then because the energy is reflected there means that some of the energy at the bottom, that acoustic energy, is not going to reach it. So you get a shadow. And if you look really close to that shadow, you can see fins on that shadow, and you can see a snout on that shadow. That's an Atlantic sturgeon based on the shadow, based on the morphology of that particular fish. So that's literally a fish that we have imaged with our side scan sonar. Most commonly, side scan sonar is used to map features on the bottom. So if you look on that same diagram, I keep chasing my mouse around the screen. And if you look at that same diagram, see a darker color here. That corresponds, we know from grab samples, to muddy sediments, so sediments of clay and silt. And these are sands where we get higher reflection. So we got sand sitting over some muds in this particular area of the Hudson River. So we can use that technology, and we've done it to do quite a bit of studies in the Hudson River, in the Delaware River, and also in the Rioni River, which is a major river in the Republic of Georgia. And it has been known for having up to 10 different species of sturgeon in that particular river. So we take our technology and have worked in that particular area. One thing that got picked up by the National Geographic on their Instagram and their Twitter account was that Andrew Refton, who was a reporter for the New York Times, environmental reporter for the New York Times, went to work for the National Geographic. He now works at Columbia University. He grew up along the Hudson River, and he loved sturgeon. And he happened to be at a reception in New York City that was attended by some people from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. And they got to talking about sturgeon. And one of them said, well, I've been working with this guy Madsen and this guy Fox, who are working on sturgeon in the Hudson River, and they image what they think is a really big fish. And so Andrew got in touch with me. And so this is actually an image that we made of Atlantic sturgeon is here. There's the shadow zone for that sturgeon. You can actually measure the length of that, about 4.3 meters long, so about 14 feet long. So really large. So that's probably, as these things grow by age, that's probably about an 85 or 90-year-old female sturgeon that's in the Hudson River. So that brought back some memories to Andrew. So he did a story and worked it up for National Geographic Online on the 14-foot big fish. Every once in a while, someone will talk to me about sturgeon. They'll say, you know, there's this big fish, and we'll go, yeah, well, that was our fish. But we haven't actually imaged it again. This is the one time that we were able to image that in the water column. More commonly, what we do is we look at areas of critical habitat. So these are an endangered species, and we're trying to get an estimate of what their population is. I'll tell you that we, in 2018, based on some integrated work that we did, and I'll show you what we did in a second, we estimated there's probably about 440 spawning Atlantic sturgeon in the Hudson River, and that's probably the largest spawning population that there is. So these are critically endangered species. That's not a lot of sturgeon. But if you want to see sturgeon doing their thing, this is sturgeon spawning in the Hudson River. Notice the habitat, the critical habitat where they are spawning. There's rock outcrop on the bottom that's shown here. And this area here is very small, coarse gravels that are located here, as opposed to being in a really sandy environment. The reason why is that the females will move over the gravels. They'll lay their eggs. the males come right over the top of where the eggs have been laid, and they will then fertilize those particular eggs, and then that's where the spawning area for the Atlantic sturgeon. So they're in this particular area, and notice that in the areas where the rock outcrops are, and these rocky areas, those are the areas that you see in orange along this stretch of the Hudson River. And the thing that you should note is you don't see very many orange areas, which means that their critical habitat is very limited. This is probably their main spawning site. Those of you familiar with the Hudson River, we're north of Poughkeepsie, New York. We're just right off of Hyde Park. And so like the Roosevelt and Vanderbilt mansions are just right off on the side of the area where we work most of the time in the river. And what we've done is we've actually combined 3 different types of technologies to be able to estimate sturgeon population and sturgeon movements. So I'm doing the side scan sonar work. So we're collecting images in the water column of actual sturgeon. We also, based on some of the information that we get, sliding over there all the way to the right, we actually can direct gill nets. So the people that we work with will put gill nets in. You can see one edge of the net here, second edge of the net over here. And if you look at the bright spots in the net, we've got about 15 sturgeon that we have been able to get into the gill net. These will be brought up to the surface. They'll then, if they're not already tagged, they'll be tagged. Sex will be determined, they'll be weighed, they'll be safely returned back into the river system. So we have to have special permits to work with these particular fish. So that's another way of getting some direct measurements and numbers. And then also when they have these sturgeon that they're able to tag, they then put little transmitters in them. We can then deploy receivers into the water column, and about every 10 minutes, one of these receivers will turn on and it will ping, and it will listen for returns from these transmitters. So we can actually calculate numbers of fish that we literally see and numbers of fish that we know that were there because of the numbers that have been tagged. We can play around with some statistics and some of the abundances of the different sturgeon to work out their population numbers. So mapping habitat and trying to determine the numbers of Atlantic sturgeon that are existing in the world, trying to get those estimates. The other thing that we're doing is actually looking at why it is that there are a bunch of sturgeon that about July into early August into the month of September all seem to congregate, coming from Canada, coming from the Hudson River, coming from rivers from New England, coming down from the Delaware River, coming across from some of the rivers in the Chesapeake Bay. They're all winding up in this area in the mouth of Delaware Bay, where in the mouth of the Delaware Bay, they seem to have a food source that they're able to work with. So my graduate student, Justin Coons, has just finished up his master's degree trying to figure out why it is that you get these large accumulations of sturgeon in this particular area. The answer is sand waves. And associated with these dynamic sand waves, which vary based on the tides coming in and coming out, are that they contain particular types of organisms that are very tasty to the sturgeon. And so the sturgeon don't eat when they spawn. So they spend about a month or 2 spawning, and then they will swim up to several hundred miles down to this area of the mouth of Delaware Bay, and then spend time feeding, regaining weight, regaining strength, and then they'll then in sort of the end of September move out into the Atlantic Ocean. They've been spotted as far south based on their acoustic tags as off the coast of northern Florida, and then they'll return back on their trips back up to the coast to then begin their spawning when they move into the next cycle. Tomorrow, I'll actually be here in the Delaware River. We're going to be launching off of the Chester Ramp, which is right there by the Commodore Barry Bridge, Route 322 there by the soccer stadium. And one of the projects that we're working on is actually mapping the bottom sediments in the Delaware River, mainly in the main channel, because there was a river deepening project that actually, some of it involved bedrock to deepen the channel from 40 to 45 feet. And in doing so, they actually had to blast out this rock material. And that rock material was in an area that we think was near where there was sturgeon spawning habitat. So we're actually going back into the river to map it using side scan sonar to see what types of potential spawning habitat there are for sturgeon in the Delaware River. We know that the numbers in the Delaware River are much, much smaller than what they were in the Hudson River. So we will maybe see some fish tomorrow. Probably not. It's a little early in the season. It's by water temperature that brings the sturgeon up the river. They're probably not quite all the way up in the Delaware River yet. So that's some of the work that I do with fisheries, mainly using acoustic devices to try to tell me about critical habitat for sturgeon and try to identify what some of their numbers are. The next thing I briefly just want to talk about is what I do with offshore wind and offshore wind development. And so you sort of figure out or ask, why is it that one would even care about soils and rock when one thinks about wind turbines? And the answer is you have to, because the thing that holds up those turbines are what are known as foundations. And those foundations are coupled with the sediments. And in doing so, that provides the ability to handle the load that comes from a wind turbine. So most of the load to a wind turbine is vertical. It's basically the weight of the turbine, the weight of the blades, the weight of the nacelle. And that basically pushes vertically downward. And it pushes downward with a size of about 10.5 meganewtons. That's just, it's a lot of meganewtons. But what's actually more important to the soils and the sediments is actually the horizontal stresses that get placed on the structure. So think about wind blowing into that turbine. That's going to put a stress, a horizontal stress, pushing into the turbine. Also think about waves and currents crashing up against, moving up against that foundation and that turbine. That also introduces a horizontal stress. Horizontal stresses produce shear. And shear stresses are what's the weakest parts of soils, and most materials are much weaker under shear stresses, horizontal stresses, they would be under vertical, or what are called normal stresses. And so we care about sediment types because we worry about being able to emplace foundations into the subsurface, and that those foundations are going to be able to hold the load. So that's why we care. And so the soil types and rock types that we have, whether it's gravel, or might even be larger gravel, might be boulders, it might be sand grains, it might be silt grains, it might be clay particles. Those types of sediments and their vertical variation would lead you to select different types of foundations. You might want to go with what's called a gravity-based foundation. You might want to drive a pile into the subsurface, maybe 30, 40 meters deep, and that would be a monopile foundation. You might want to take a 55-gallon drum, essentially, only much bigger, and have the open bottom of it, sink it down to the ocean bottom, and then pump the air out to force it to sink down into the sediments. And that's what's called a suction caisson design. That's one that's shown here, or smaller versions of piles or caissons. All of these types that you would select and how you would design them really depends upon the soil structure and the load that the turbine places on those soils and on that foundation. You also care because you have to connect wind turbine to wind turbine via array cables, and then from the turbines to an offshore electrical substation like here. And then you have to get sometimes up to 10 to 15 miles of cable from the substation to onshore. And so when you have to essentially bury these cables, most typically 1 to 2 meters beneath the surface, you have to be able to jet them in and put them into the bottom. So therefore, the type of sediment that you have can determine how easy or where you can or cannot put an export cable. And export cables are very expensive, and you want to make sure that you get them down and they're protected once they're down and have been emplaced into the bottom. You also care because around the bottom installations, once you have them in, bottom currents will bring water energy across that bottom surface, and that can cause scour. And so different sediments will scour in different ways. And if you begin to scour large amounts of sediment around the foundation, that can loosen and decrease the strength of that particular foundation. So we worry about sediments because of the way that the roles that they can play in terms of the foundations. And when you think about cost, if I think about the cost of a wind turbine foundation, not the turbine itself, but just the foundation, about 1/5 to 1/4 of the entire project cost, and a 30, 40, 50 turbine offshore wind producing 400 or 500 megawatts is probably about a $2 billion, $3 billion project. 1/5 to 1/4 of that cost is on your selections of your foundations and where you put them and how you get them in place. So the geologic aspects become relatively important. I don't want to go too much longer. I want to sort of keep us on time. I just want to give you an example where that might come into play. And so let's look at the area in red there. It's called the Wilmington Canyon Project Site, a theoretical offshore project where we were asked to come up with a 10% price reduction in the cost of theoretically developing this particular offshore wind farm. And so I looked at the geologic setting, and one of the unique things about the geologic setting of this Delaware Wind Energy Area site is that, remember, we're in a continental margin. Global sea level rises and falls. When global sea level was lower 10,000 years ago, there was, instead of Delaware Bay here, there was a Delaware River. So think what Philadelphia looks like today. That's what this part of the continental margin looked like at that time. And we have mapped those paleochannels, the blue one in particular. You can follow this squiggly line here, seismic reflection data, that maps out that paleochannel. And here's the base of it, here's the bottom of it. And once you have the paleochannels, when sea level rises, then sediments infill those channels and sea level continues to rise, and we wind up with this paleochannel that's buried in the subsurface. The quick answer is the fill of these paleochannels is much more complex than the surrounding sediments. So if you're worried about designing a wind turbine foundation, you would like to have a very simple model for the subsurface. So therefore, if you have to design something with a safety factor, you would be much better off trying to design and locate the foundation here where there's less variability than to locate it here where there is a complex paleochannel that has been infilled. So what we recommended in this particular project is where you begin to lay out your turbine foundations. And here we laid out a plan about a nautical mile apart based on the prevailing wind directions. Note how I avoided putting them in the area of gray, because the area of gray in the subsurface has really complex sediments. So here we're using the geologic setting and the ways that the continental shelf has been formed to think about and inform how we might locate and then what type of foundation we might select to use. So that's my role in how geologists get involved in working in offshore wind projects. So hopefully I didn't blab for too much time, and I'd like to take any questions if anyone has at this time, but I just want to give you a feeling for some of the stuff that I work on.
Are most organizations or businesses that are trying to place wind turbines required to consult with people like you who do these analyses to help them figure out where to put them so that they don't affect any ecological processes?
Unfortunately, no, they're really not. However, they have consultants that they work with, and they have the federal government has guidelines that they also follow. So the federal government will say, you need to do what they call a desktop survey. You need to tell me about the ecosystems, the wind patterns, the geological sediments in the shallow subsurface, the cultural artifacts, et cetera, that might be in a particular area. Based on that, then they would have information that they could then use with their design engineers to work out their foundation designs. I will tell you that there's a lot of miscommunications between geologists and engineers, because I've worked with engineers who have developed models for foundations, and they have said things like, I need to know the strength of your sediment in your soil profile. And I will say, well, I can't give you one number because this soil profile has a lot of variable sediments in that, and we need to think about what that variation is going to be. And they look at me and they go like, well, don't worry, we'll just integrate it for one answer. So it's still, as we think about this geologic setting, there's still a lot of education that needs to go on with those particular groups. But the developers are, because it's so much money involved, they're becoming much more likely to think about geologic setting as well as other factors. Initially, it was basically distance from shore. The further off you go, the more expensive it is. How shallow the water is. Generally, the shallower it is, the less money that you have to spend. And the most important, of course, being the wind resource, where the wind speeds are the highest. And then also you have to think about ecological concerns in terms of organisms that might be present in the area. So you put that all into a risk assessment matrix, blah, 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 and come up with the preferred siting area that might take place.
Last spring, we had a representative from, I believe the company was Ørsted, come speak to us about wind turbines off the coast of Rehoboth. Have you
Yes.
worked with this company before?
We do. We've actually have some of our Delaware alumni that work with them. It's a well-known Danish company. We actually, along with Willett Kempton, we offer what's called the Offshore Wind Skills Academy. It's basically we take and it's run through our university, but we actually get instructors, not professors, that are actually experienced in the European offshore wind game. And so we have some members from Orstal that will help teach some of our courses for doing that. And so we've got a good working relationship with them. So they're looking at, building offshore, what is it, about 12 to 15 miles or so off the coast to move away from viewshed type issues. And they're beginning to look now and doing the geophysical and geotechnical surveys to figure out where their siting for their turbines are going to be.
Going back to the Atlantic sturgeon work, I may have missed it. You were talking about like the spawning sites and habitat selection.
Yeah.
You mentioned that I believe you mentioned they spawn on gravelly and sandy substrates near rocky outcrops. Why is it near the rocky outcrops?
Because it's near the rocky outcrops that you get the weathering and the erosion that produces the gravels. So those particular areas, in particular, it's the gravels that are really interested in, because if you get into the sands and if you're in just sandy areas, then the eggs will get rolled up as the sand grains move. And so we need sort of that, once we begin to see a sandy habitat, we look for near areas of bedrock outcrop, and that's the areas that tend to have the most gravel. So again, it's associated with the bedrock with it.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Is there any way to, since there has been a lot of river dredging that's happened currently and in the past, is there any way to restore like sections of the river to make it more like acceptable for the fish, or are they like candidates for any kind of like captive breeding, or would they just be totally lost since they can't?
There have been some programs up in Canada for captive breeding that have taken place. I'm not sure how successful that has been. The areas where they have done the blasting, and so by blasting they have going to generated areas for gravels and rocky material. Potentially that could be habitat, good spawning habitat for the Atlantic sturgeon. That's something that we want to get back in and look at. We actually collected some data from 2013. We can compare to what we have it collected now. The one problem with the Delaware River is that navigation channel, 45 feet deep, is relatively narrow. So anytime if you see two large freighters or tankers moving past each other, it's a pretty amazing thing to see how close they actually get, because they need to maintain themselves within the channel. They also have a relatively high draft to them. And so the Atlantic sturgeon are mainly bottom or near bottom fish. And so probably the biggest threat to them now are ship strikes, where the bottom of the ship or the propellers of the ship will strike the sturgeon. And so although the area where they blasted has produced a better habitat, it's the proximity to vessel positions that also makes a difference for that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any concern for the stress associated with tagging the sturgeon and how that might impact their fitness, since they are such an endangered species?
There is, and so it's very difficult to get a license to be able to handle the fish, and you're required to report all incidents anytime there might be an injury when that happens. And so I can just tell you that the group is as careful as they can be for doing that. There's several groups that have permissions to do that. The group I work with from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation are very careful when they do that tagging. There is certainly some stress that happens to the fish, but I guess the ability to be able to get that important information that you can from being able to tag them, that has overcome. I don't know of any in the last 3 years of this group's tagging that there has been any mortality from doing that. I can tell you from the Maria Cuomo Bridge, that used to be the old Tappan Zee Bridge, that they, I think at least 3 or 4 times went over their take limit in terms of Atlantic sturgeon that they did. And that was never really pursued as strongly as it should have been. And so there are other stressors as well. But yeah, they are very concerned about the tagging operations that take place.
Okay, so when you were investigating like the sturgeon massing in the Delaware River, one of the things that you mentioned that they did was examining their gut contents to see what they were
Yeah.
eating.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the only way to get into a fish's gut is to cut them open. So,
Oh,
how?
actually not. So lavage, we're gonna use a hose, and we're gonna bring the water through. That's going to bring the gut contents. Well, that will then come out, and you can analyze them that way. So there's actually, you didn't actually have to the only cut that you would do for the sturgeon would be to do the transmitter, and the gut contents was through a lavaging technique.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes that's a
And
much
then
better.
and I feel for my graduate student, because Justin came to me as a geologist who was really interested in studying sediments, and I said, that's great, we've got some great sediments to study, but oh, by the way, we're also going to image some fish, and we need someone to do some analyses of their gut contents to determine what they're feeding. So Justin got a little bit more than he bargained for by getting to look under a microscope to identify, partially digested organisms from the sturgeon.
Okay, great. If there's no more questions, thank you, Dr. Madsen, for sharing your
You're welcome.
research. Very interesting. One, to learn that sturgeon can grow to 24 feet. I did not know they got that big. But next we'll go to Dr. McCarthy, who will share his topic. Oh my gosh.
Can you
What?
guys see me?
How'd you do
Is that
that?
the Earth? Oh my gosh. So if I'm on gallery view, you may want to switch me to speaker view in Zoom, because I'm not going to use a shared screen. We're just going to look at it next to me. And I think kind of like Dr. Ellis, I'm going to take a slightly circuitous route as I head towards my research, which I think is what you mentioned. You wanted me to talk about a little bit. But I think what I research and my career itself goes way back, not just to my childhood, but before my childhood, and relates to the first Earth Day, and also what was happening before the first Earth Day, and how that energy was harnessed for Earth Day. And so what I'm actually going to go back to first is thinking about when we were in a very long war, like one that we're currently in, the Vietnam War. And there was a lot of protest at universities, and not just protests, but teach-ins. And universities were really serving as this place, right, where you of young minds and ideals get together and talk and digest what's going on in the world, and start to help the country maybe shift the narrative a little bit. And so this picture here is from Penn State, actually. And that "Dow shall not kill" sign on the wall is not the Dow Jones Industrial, but Dow Chemical. And this was a teach-in, sit-in specifically about the production of napalm by Dow Chemicals. This is relevant because this is when my parents were young, and actually my dad was of age for the draft, and his number was called right when the US was pulling back out of Vietnam, at least ground troops, and we're turning more to an aerial assault and support. And so he didn't end up going. But you can imagine this is kind of percolating in my parents' minds, and kind of I don't want to say the next big event, but this energy that was seen in universities in terms of maybe shifting a narrative was something that the founder of Earth Day wanted to harness. And that's why Earth Day is today, right? That's because this is supposed to be after your guys' spring breaks. It's supposed to be kind of at a non-exam time. It's supposed to be at a time when university students can really maybe be involved in something. Now, even on the first Earth Day, it got well beyond the corridors of a university and ended up across the nation. And pretty shortly after the first Earth Day, it ended up across the world. And I thought this picture was very interesting. This is from the 1970 Earth Day, the very first one, where they're wearing masks, and in this time to protest air quality, right? But we have very different reasons we're wearing masks right now. Um, but again, I'm not born yet at this point. This is 1970, but my parents are moving forward in life and meeting each other and getting married, and then going to college themselves and deciding to have me and have me in 1979. But they've kind of gone through some of these big events, and I think it's really shaped them. And what shapes your parents can tend to shape you. And you know, it started to shape my childhood. And so I want to bounce from pre-me to me and think about my childhood a little bit. And some of my earliest memories are getting in a Volkswagen van. So we still have the 70s going on there, right? And driving to Alaska, where we're going to move because my father is going to do a master's degree there on brown bear food habits. And we were living on Admiralty Island. That's the island you see in the upper left. It's one of the largest islands in the world. It also has the densest brown bear population in the world. And so people were interested in how brown bears could be so dense. What were they eating on this island that allowed them to be at the densities they were at? And this is kind of the beginning of the shaping of my life. And so, you know, obviously science and wildlife are playing a big part of it. But it would be unfair not to mention the side brought by my mother also. And so she also was growing up through the 70s and then becoming married in the 70s and having children in the 70s, and had a very strong conservation ethic and a strong conservation focus. And while my dad was pursuing conservation in the sense of research on wildlife, she was pursuing environmentalism by working for various environmental organizations. The one that really stood out from my childhood was the Southeast Alaska, Conservation Council, so SEAC. And SEAC was an organization that was fighting for the Tongass. And so if you're not familiar with the Tongass, this is the largest temperate rainforest, the largest intact temperate rainforest in the world. And so it's a rainforest, but temperate, right? So it's a little different than the tropical rainforest, but it's still defined by a lot of rain. And I would argue just as beautiful as the tropical rainforest. But a lot of my childhood then was spent stuffing envelopes, hanging flyers, sitting at PBS while people called in to donate money. I've got a picture of the Rainbow Warrior there from Greenpeace because I very much remember standing on the docks as it pulled into the harbor and holding my Save the Tongass sign and meeting the captain of the Rainbow Warrior as they came in. So I did have this, I guess, strong urge for environmentalism and in a sense, environmental activism. Now, tied in with that was still the ongoing, you know, other aspect of my life, and they were intertwined, so I shouldn't say they're separate, but of wildlife and wildlife biology and wildlife conservation. We were a de facto wildlife rehab center. We had deer, we had porcupines, we had hawks, we had baby brown bears, all sorts of stuff living in our house, on our deck, in our garage, obviously in our bathroom with the deer. And I got to participate in some of my father's research at that point. So this is a young me moving forward towards college and my own career. I was a voracious reader. I still am. I can't go to sleep without reading, and I read for quite a while before I can finally fall asleep. And whenever I've got free time, which is less often than before, I have a book in front of me. But at this age, there was a variety of books kind of shaping my own self. And one was The Monkey Wrench Gang. And has anybody read The Monkey Wrench Gang? I can see some of you on videos. All right. It's quite a read. This is by Edward Abbey, an environmental activist. And I'm not recommending doing the things that are in this book. It's things like pouring sugar in gas tanks, and, you know, putting spikes in trees, burning down billboards, things that were, you know, environmental activism, in the sense of what might be called environmental, maybe anarchy at this point. Now, none of these things were things that necessarily actually happened, and I'm not good with words, so maybe they were supposed to be metaphors or whatever you call them for the actions that need to happen. And so the passion that people need to have for our environment and what we need to do. And so, for instance, in the end of this book, George Hayduke and the doc and the gang rent a houseboat and fill it with explosives and sink it next to a giant hydroelectric dam in an attempt to blow up the dam. Now, not a good idea, right? What it was representing, though, what really happened was a large protest over that dam, where they unfurled a long sheet of plastic, I can't remember what it was, of black plastic representing the dam being broken, to gain media attention, to get focus on projects like this that were causing harm to the environment. So I shouldn't talk about that book anymore. There were other books also that I was incredibly keen on. James Herriot's whole series. I thought I wanted to be a vet. Half of us do. Most of us do at some point in our childhood. Sand County Almanac, learning from the father of wildlife biology at that point. So these things are kind of shaping where I want to go with my life. Also shaping where I want to go is my continued experience. As a high schooler, we moved to Mongolia, where my dad was pursuing his PhD on snow leopards. And in that process, I think as I still was young but grew older, I started to appreciate the science of conservation and how using science you could affect big change in the world, and that maybe we could have wildlife stick around with us. So maybe moving a little more towards the Sand County Almanac book than the Monkey Wrench Gang book. I got lucky enough to hold one of these creatures there, and it was kind of a defining moment too. It's weird. I had held brown bears and mountain goats and all sorts of things in my life by this point, but there was something so, I don't know, mystical and majestic about this rare creature and holding it while it was sedated, I should mention, and very much not dead, and it's being fitted with a radio collar, a fair amount larger than the pit tags they're sticking in the sturgeons, but we didn't have readers to pick them up. We needed to be able to get them from a satellite, and trying to track where they were going. And so this all led into, I guess maybe not too circuitously, but into the shapings of my own research, because after returning from Mongolia and finishing high school, I went to undergrad myself at Colorado State to do a degree in wildlife biology. And after that, ended up at University of Massachusetts Amherst doing a master's degree. And fortunately, because of my associations and my experience, I was able to get a master's project working on snow leopards. And I spent the better part of a year in Kyrgyzstan with my wife, and we were doing research on snow leopards. We weren't capturing them in hand this time. We were using camera traps, but we were also collecting snow leopard poop to look at DNA and get population estimates. We were doing ungulate counts to estimate the amount of prey availability for the species, for the snow leopards. And we were doing sign surveys, another technique to look at snow leopard populations. And so this research was really focused on how we can best estimate snow leopard numbers and trying to rectify some of the discrepancies we had in different methods that we used for that. And so it was an applied project, and I very much like applied research. It's something that can directly then impact how we conserve a species. And that's what we were doing for the snow leopards. And the findings helped then people start to shift their sign surveys and move more towards things like camera trapping to have better numbers on snow leopards. Okay, I better move forward too. Let's see. So I moved forward and changed. I wanted to not only be in my father's shadow at this point. I had spent a lot of time with cats. I wanted to study birds for a while. And so I did a project on these amazing creatures, and I love them just as much as snow leopards, and they have just as much personality, and they're much easier to see because you can drive your boat around until you find one and then stare at them for hours. And that's what I did. And I was looking at food habits, or sorry, not food habits. I was looking at how they responded to boats. And there had been a change in boating on this national wildlife refuge. And the refuge managers were curious if loon behavior was shifting and if that could be the reason behind loon nesting success to have dropped off completely. From 22 successful nesting pairs, they were down to one successful nesting pair in a matter of years. And so my research really focused on their behavior in relationship to boats in the area. I also was lucky enough to go help my wife on her PhD project in Sumatra. And so we got to travel to Indonesia. She was studying small cats. And so I was back in the cat world a little bit. And she had gotten into it after our Kyrgyzstan journey together. She originally studied Norwegian or Atlantic salmon out of Norway, but she was looking at small cats and how they can exist both together in the forest, but also then how they can exist in forest fragments outside of national parks. Moving through different research, finished with the PhD, you often go to do a postdoc, and Dr. Ellis was talking about his postdoc in Brazil. Mine was in Florida, and it was on Florida panthers. I didn't get to see them or hold them, but it was mostly data crunching. But it was, again, an applied research project and it related back kind of to my loon research. There was a history of hunting in Big Cypress National Preserve for deer and feral hogs and Osceola turkeys. But the hunting tradition revolves around the use of off-road vehicles and all sorts of interesting off-road vehicles, these giant buggies they use to get through the cypress swamps down there. And similar to before, this was the Panther National Wildlife Refuge, along with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, wanting an understanding of how the use of those off-road vehicles impacted panther behavior, because it's an endangered species. And if their behavior is being impacted, then things need to at least be adjusted. And so that was kind of I don't know, a postdoc's weird. You're between stages. You're no longer a student, but you're not yet, your own research faculty member. But it did launch me towards the next stage of my career and into my current research. I want, before I talk about research, though, to talk about maybe the more exciting part of my job, and that's you guys. That's the students. I absolutely love being able to try and share my passion for the outdoors and for wildlife and for nature with students. And I get so many different opportunities too, because I do teach a lot of courses, and from I have 259 students in 201 right now. And I assume some of you have taken the NWC 201, because about 1 in every 8 students in the university does. And that gives me a chance to reach out to them and to share passion with them. And this is actually in Costa Rica, where we were on our study abroad program there. So that's, to me, maybe my most important part of my job. But I do also run a research lab, and my research does somewhat follow my background that probably started back in the Vietnam War, as my parents were growing up and through Earth Day becoming environmentalists and then moving into science. And I've had grad students. Let's see, we've done projects. The top project there was looking at snow leopards in Kyrgyzstan. I'm sorry, Tajikistan in this case. And I had Shannon over there. He was looking at how we could use trophy hunting reserves as a means of conservation of snow leopards. And now, not hunting for snow leopards, but hunting for argali, which is a big wild sheep species with giant horns, and people will pay upwards of $50,000 to go harvest one. to be able to have harvests, you need to have a healthy population of them. To have a healthy population of them, you need to have kind of a protected ecosystem. So the thought process and what we were trying to research was, could we kind of harness that and turn it into a means to have strong snow leopard conservation, especially if we tied it to snow leopard conservation in the sense of the permits for trophy harvest will only be issued in areas where snow leopards are protected. My next student was Sarah down below. She's working, she collected leeches. And so this escaped the cat world a little bit. These were leeches from Bangladesh. We tried this in Sumatra, but they wouldn't let us take our leeches out of the country. So they're still sitting in a freezer over there. But we got some from Bangladesh, and these are hematophagous leeches. So they suck blood of things, right? And they suck blood of mammals and other stuff. But by collecting them, we could then non-invasively survey mammal biodiversity. It was invasive to the leeches because we sliced them open and took their guts out and saw what was inside and did DNA on it. But it was an interesting way to try and less expensively and with less effort, because all you do is stand there and the leeches come towards you to try to bite you, sample mammal biodiversity in a very dense tropical forest. Other research I've been involved in or led in my lab, Biba in the top just actually defended his PhD after 9 long years, although he had a job with Flora and Fauna International for half of those, so it was not his fault, on tiger populations in Sumatra. And there's a big effort to double tiger populations across the world. And that requires having good estimates of their population. And there's a lot of issues with people using lousy science and deciding that tiger numbers have doubled when they actually haven't. And so he was trying to do an island-wide tiger estimate, and that island, just for reference, is 4 times the size of PA. It's bigger than California. It's a big island. Hassan has been doing research in Bangladesh also. He's from Bangladesh. He's been doing research on all sorts of cat species and forest fragments in Bangladesh, but then also now he's shifted to the Sundarbans of Bangladesh, where he's studying tigers and their interactions with humans. And again, applied research in terms of trying to limit threats to humans from tigers, but threats to tigers from humans at the same time. Imogene, who you mentioned in the very beginning in terms of going viral on Twitter, she's working on snow leopards also for her PhD. She did work on bobcats for her master's degree, so she knew what she was talking about in her Twitter stream. She's studying snow leopard phylogenetics range-wide, and this is really going to help us understand subpopulations of snow leopards. This is going to help us understand refugia for snow leopards during the last ice age, but then also how that's going to inform, conservation planning and conservation mapping, and where it might be most important to protect for snow leopards. And then I don't have a picture on here. So Ariana has just been working on bobcats in New Jersey. Not everything's in another country, right? And she's been looking at the connectivity in New Jersey for bobcats to get between the different forest fragments in New Jersey. And there's a bunch of bobcats in northern New Jersey, but there's none in southern New Jersey, as far as we know. But they would like some there. And so we've been working with the state and developing a lot of models of habitat connectivity, but then also models for what's going to happen if the state decides to take some bobcats down into the Pine Barrens, for instance, and release them. And how many would they have to release before we could have bobcats reestablished down there? And I can't get away without saying I have undergrads constantly doing research in my lab, and I love it. And I like it maybe even more than my grad students, just because it's like that first stab at getting a chance to do something and moving forward their own careers. And it's ranged from assessing biodiversity in our created, restored, and natural wetlands on campus with small mammal track tubes that you see in the upper left, to assessing deer poop to see if we could find out if there were residues of pesticides in it, to you can't really see them, but going to Panama and assessing small cat species, and with my wife, who has a project going in Panama on jaguarundis, and then to lots of poop. And so the other ones, the people in the mask are pulling apart snow leopard poop, and you got to be a little bit careful because carnivore scat can sometimes harbor things after it's sat around for a while that you don't want to breathe in. But they're pulling apart snow leopard scat and informing us on what snow leopards eat, so we can have a better understanding of the prey species we need to protect for snow leopard populations. I feel like I talked too long, but I always do, but maybe I didn't. But yeah, roundabout, that's how I got to where I'm at in the research I do. And I'm sure we all will have our stories about you'll all have your stories when you end up in your careers, and they're already beginning right now, right? Because you're at that first stage as undergrads. So I'm open to any questions.
The stuff with the leeches sounds really like interesting. Like, did that like work? Like, were you able to like figure out like what type of mammals were like in the area based on like what was inside the leeches? Was it like accurate?
Yes, it worked, and it was accurate. And it was maybe more accurate. So, we did camera trapping in conjunction with that. So we had photographic records from the same areas. And the camera trapping was obviously much more labor intensive, but it was part of another project that Hassan was doing for his small cat research. And so it was a nice way to pair some research. And, even with a small sample size of leeches, because we didn't have a ton, I think we ended up with 200 leeches. We were able to really well match the species richness estimates for the area. And there were maybe some species we caught on camera that we didn't catch on leech, but there were more that we didn't catch on camera that we caught on leech, and especially some of the smaller species that you can't tell on a camera trap and or don't trigger a camera trap. And there's a lot of little mammals running around that are harder to get pictures of unless you specifically targeted them. So it did work. It was the continuation of someone else's research, standing on someone else's shoulders that had tried it with just 20 or 30 leeches in a more controlled setting to prove that you could use blood meals to see what they had fed on. And we wanted to take it the next step and prove that it could work in a wild setting then. And so eDNA also, all these different sources for DNA right now are fascinating and a neat way to non-invasively study things, except for the leech, but there's lots of them.
That's very cool. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Do you know if it's possible to do that with other like blood consuming species?
Yeah. And I full disclosure, I am not a geneticist, but there happens to be one on this panel. And I was recently talking to Dr. Ellis about this, but Vincenzo, Dr. Ellis, what other species, can you do it from mosquito blood meals? Like, can you see what they fed on?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is that, the longer you wait after they've fed, the faster they digest the blood, and then the less chance you have of actually being able to extract the DNA out. So for ticks, for instance, you can't really do it. It's too long. They take one blood meal. Mosquitoes, if you find an engorged mosquito, you're good to go. You can figure out what it's eating.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and for the leeches, it seemed like when they were hungry again, so when they were seeking their next meal, they still had their last one in them. So I don't know what that time frame was, but I think we were lucky in that regard that most of the leeches we analyzed had something in them.
So your lab is the Rare and Elusive Species Lab, and it sounds like all of your work is terrestrial, but I'm wondering if you do anything in aquatic or marine environments as well.
I don't. And I that's a whole nother realm when it comes to research, right? And even when it comes to mammals in water, it's just something that usually takes a different specialty and a different course of education than what I have. And I would love to. Loons were in water.
this question is not about your research at all, so I'm sorry. But how do you do the cool transitions with your Zoom?
These cool things.
Yeah.
I'm using a program called, well, you probably are familiar with Prezi, the web-based presentation software. They have a Prezi video function that you can download an app, and then my camera is actually going through the app into Zoom, and so it's all manipulated that way.
Cool. And
It
then
just-
a more personal question is, have you worked with your father on research before, or does he still do research or teach?
Yeah, absolutely. So he was by the time I was in college, he was the director of the snow leopard program for Panthera. Panthera is a NGO that focuses primarily on big cats, hence the name Panthera, the genus of the big cats. Although they do have some small cat research too. And so this is an NGO that gathered basically all the top biologists in the world for each species, and that was my dad's realm for snow leopards. And so my snow leopard projects have all been with him, and my first one with Shannon doing the research on trophy hunting, and then also Imogene's project as well on snow leopards. He's retired now, and so he still serves as a committee member on those projects, but so I may not have any more snow leopard projects directly with him, but rather with his successor. But yeah, no, and it's been a blast, and it's I know as a graduate student, my urge to do something different and do research on loons, you do as a younger person, I was afraid that it was all just nepotism, and that was what I was. But I'm a little more comfortable in my own skin now, and it's much easier to not worry about it and do research with my dad and enjoy it.
So I had no idea there were bobcats in New Jersey.
Yeah.
And I know you said they're talking about moving them further south in Jersey. So where can I go see these bobcats? And is it possible they'll spread further throughout like the eastern coast?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now, Delaware is the only state in the contiguous United States without them. And so they actually are in the East Coast. They're in Maryland, they're in Pennsylvania, and they're definitely as you move further north. And then they start to blend in with the lynx as you get up into northern Maine.
So sorry to interrupt. What's their range? Like, because, when you're talking about, like, say, Pennsylvania bobcats versus, like, I don't know, Delaware bobcats versus, upstate New York bobcats, what's their range and how far do they go?
By range, do you mean the range of the species or the range of an individual?
No, I mean the range of like an individual group of them.
Yeah, I mean, so they're an individual species, and I'll try to answer both questions at once here. So they individual in the sense of they don't hang out together except for when it's time to make a baby, and so a female's home range is a little smaller than a male's. I believe it's about 12 square kilometers. So not super large. But then there's also what's called dispersal movement, right? And so that might be a female's home range, but then when a female has kittens, when those kittens reach a certain age, they're going to disperse and they're going to move until they find a vacant territory that they can establish, because they're too young to try and fight some old cat for it. And so then they can go quite a ways. They can go 100 kilometers. And so that's how they can go further than 100. That's just a number I'm throwing out. But that's how they can establish in new areas. The problem in New Jersey, getting back to your question about them spreading, is to get from the north to the south, they have to cross the I-95 corridor. And not just is there a 12-lane highway or whatever it is, but there's the associated urbanization alongside it. And so, there's not even any great like rivers that flow through there with enough riparian habitat that they could easily make it through there. New Jersey's awesome in terms of some of their environmental legislation. You know, they have a new law that any new road, any new bridge on a road, so anything that's going over a waterway has to include terrestrial passage for a species. And that also means any repaired like culvert coverage or bridge has to include passage for terrestrial species. And so that means, you know, some sort of pathway beside where the water flows, not just funneling it through a narrow tube. And so that's exciting. And so that might be one way bobcats can start to spread more, but we may need to fly them to the south or drive them to the south if we're going to get them there. If you want to see bobcats, they're hard to see, but there actually are some protected areas in the north where they're at, and there's some really beautiful bobcat territory there, bobcat habitat, excuse me. I'm trying to remember the name of one, but if you look up, I think it's the Nature Conservancy in New Jersey that's got a really nice property. But I don't know, you could go at least pretend you might see one. You can find their tracks, look for underpasses, look for places going under a road. They'll get funneled under there, and you can find their tracks in the sand next to the river. So. Any other questions? Can be for anyone else too.
If anyone thinks of any questions for the other panel members at this time, you can also ask Dr. Ellis and Dr. Madsen if you had forgotten a question or it came to you.
I actually have a question for Dr. Ellis. So like with the maps, looking at how small the Atlantic forest has gotten, like, are there a lot of efforts in place to kind of try to restore that? I know you said a lot of it's coffee plantation. Like, do you know anything about it, if there's ways they're working to kind of work with those people to kind of bridge that gap in a sense?
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, there's a lot of active efforts to protect remnant remaining fragments. Yeah, in terms of sort of restoring areas, I'm not sure how much there is. And it's not all coffee, especially in Sao Paulo, but also just, you know, yeah, urban developments. People do there's a lot of ranching, a lot of cattle, lots of people will chop down forests and plant eucalyptus. It grows quickly, and it's viewed as an investment for your future because you can chop it down and sell it. And it's so yeah, there's yeah, I'm not really aware of any, you know, major scale, but I know that, I mean, the Brazilian government has a very strong environmental agency, and you know, there are lots of parks that are out there that are very, you know, with lots of good enforcement and stuff.
I have a quick question for Dr. McCarthy. You mentioned about like the policy in New Jersey with like to help like move the bobcats, and I'm just wondering like comparatively to like the policy in like Florida with like the panthers, if that's correct. Like I'm wondering if like is it possible moving on through just the state, and how can like these policies can be implemented like throughout the whole country? Do you think that's like a possible option?
I think it's probably going to always be a state by state thing. You know, I'm sure that there could be some legislation around interstates, maybe. I don't understand enough about the transportation system to know who owns what and who spends money on what. But yeah, I think it's gonna be state by state. And you know, for the Florida panthers, they're an endangered species, and so when one of their primary threats is getting hit by cars, then there was money that had to be designated to try to limit that threat. And those are underpasses that don't even involve rivers. You know, they just built giant underpasses for cougars and other wildlife. But in New Jersey, they haven't gotten to that point yet. They're not putting in underpasses just to put in an underpass. They're doing it in conjunction with needed repair work or road construction. But there's so many different initiatives across the country. They're trying to make overpasses to do the Brown Bear corridor between Montana and Canada, and a lot of that involves giving passage over highways, and a lot of that's funded not just federally but by NGOs and all sorts of organizations trying to spread brown bear populations. So there's opportunities for it, but I imagine it's going to be state by state. But don't quote me on that, because maybe tomorrow the feds will be like, yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
Oh no, that's all. I said thank you. Sorry.
Okay, so with both of the bobcats and the panthers, I know that in Florida there's quite a bit of cattle ranching. There's also a decent amount of horses, and I'm sure there's some in New Jersey, but I don't know the New Jersey livestock situation. So I don't know how much of an issue is that presenting now and potentially presenting like 20 years from now if those populations start recovering more.
It's always an issue if you have a predator around livestock, right? And for a bobcat, it's an issue if it's poultry, but it's not going to be an issue for cows or horses. And yeah, it's something you always have to manage with an endangered species, is the impact on human livelihoods, and there's a lot of different ways people do that, or that the agencies do that. In Florida, I don't know that it's been a big issue, because they have a hard enough time getting out of their protected areas because of all of their roads, that I don't know that they have that many cattle kills by cougars. And I don't know how easily, a cougar, I think you'd be picturing more of it taking out a sheep or a goat, and I just don't know what that, or maybe a baby cow. But an elk is a big animal for a cougar, and a cow's bigger. So yeah, no, but it's definitely something that plays into management plans and recovery plans and projecting into the future. It's been a big deal for the red wolves in North Carolina, right, as they try to figure out that. And obviously regular gray wolves out in Montana and Wyoming as they've started to expand. But I think in southern New Jersey with bobcats, you would definitely need a survey of, you'd need to do human dimensions work first and understand people's thoughts about bobcats. And then you'd have to try to address them before you even put the first bobcats out there, basically allaying their fears or setting up some sort of insurance program or something to give them reassurance that if they lose a chicken or two to a bobcat, their life won't end. So yeah.
I have a question about the bobcats. So you're talking about introducing them to southern New Jersey. Is it safe to assume they used to be in southern New Jersey?
Yeah, and so historical records do put them down there, and like most carnivores, like most cats, we've just systematically removed them through trapping, especially for the fur trade. And so we wouldn't be putting them in a place that they didn't used to be. Yeah, good question though. Yeah.
Right. And then so like a follow-up question to tag on to that was, like, I know in certain places like deer populations are through the roof because predators have been removed. Is there anything that has been like out of balance in southern New Jersey because bobcats have been removed?
I'm not as sure. I think that whole ecosystem's a little out of balance. I know they're trying to, for instance, reintroduce quail there and having a hard time of it. I don't think bobcats would help with the quail reintroduction though, because they like to eat quail. So you may see a slight shift in the other mesocarnivores down there. Bobcats don't tend to cause too many problems for red fox or gray fox or even coyotes. They have kind of a pretty specific niche as a pretty reclusive, secretive, solitary predator. And I don't know that they'd play much of a role in controlling deer populations, obviously, but maybe getting back to Vincenzo's or Dr. Ellis's discussion of small mammal populations and forest fragments and increased in disease prevalence, a species like a bobcat may help with something like that, because they're definitely going to eat a lot of little mice and everything. So who knows? Good question though.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, you said that the bobcats, they're in a lot of the states along the East Coast, but they're not in Delaware. Is that just because Delaware is not very forested?
It's because we trapped them out, so they used to be here, and it's because we're on a peninsula, and the part of the peninsula that's north of the Delmarva, or sorry, what's that canal called? The C&D Canal, is pretty urban dominated without a lot of forest, and their majority of the remaining habitats south of that canal, and that's a hard canal to get over because you got to take a bridge, and they're probably not going to swim that distance. And if one does, and probably one or two has, they're not going to establish a population very easily because they're not going to find another one, and so they're going to get hit by a car eventually or just die, and you're not going to see them down there. So I actually have an undergrad right now. Her senior thesis project is on evaluating available habitat for bobcats in Delaware, with the same concept of what we're doing in New Jersey about whether or not Delaware might have bobcats again in the future. And it seems like there's a few places they could. So yeah.
That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're starting to run a little bit late, and I know we all have lives to get back to, but I just wanted to wrap up by thanking Dr. Ellis, Dr. Madsen, and Dr. McCarthy for speaking us tonight. I think we all learned a lot. It's really great to learn outside of the major. I know about half of us are marine science majors. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective, your research, and your interests. And happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you guys again for
Thank you.
inviting
Yeah,
us.
happy Earth Day, everybody.
Yeah.
And if any of us
you.
have more
Thank
questions, is it okay if we reach out to you?
Absolutely, yeah.
No problem.
Okay.
That's what we're here for.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night,
Take
everyone.
care.
You
Care.
guys.
Happy Earth Day.
Thank you.